You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 477 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, talking about Bernie Sanders getting out of the presidential race, setting up a Trump-Biden showdown in November. I have more information on the coronavirus and the reaction to it, especially by the U.S. government. And then I'm talking about a few of the wars going on in the Middle East, Syria, Afghanistan, and how the coronavirus is impacting that. All right, listeners, the most important thing you could do to help out the show is to share it. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor and write the daily news roundup. Both the show and the roundup can be found on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. Make sure you subscribe to the show. I mostly update current events going on with the U.S. empire. And if you don't miss an episode, you'll get the most out of the show. It's up everywhere people listen to podcasts. And while you're there, ratings, reviews, likes, whatever you could do to help get the podcast noticed by potential new listeners. And then if you really want to support the show, you go on to patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus and donate to the show that way. All right, so the first thing, Bernie Sanders has announced that he's ending his campaign, although I guess he's going to stay on the ballot in the coming, primaries, should they end up happening or not. My guess is a lot of these elections will have to happen to some extent because there's like local initiatives and stuff that goes on the ballot at the same time as the primaries, or different local elections or statewide elections. Those kind of positions are up for grabs at times. However, if he's not campaigning, his crew isn't there trying to get out the vote and everything like that. And if he's effectively ended his campaign, especially as we're moving forward, gonna have people with the coronavirus still in their mind, whether that's, an ongoing outbreak that this summer or not. I think people are going to be a lot more cautious just about being in public, especially something like voting where you could be in a long line, standing around a lot of people you don't know. I think people are going to be hesitant to do that. So with, Bernie Sanders ending his campaign, I mean, this definitely hands the nomination to Joe Biden. Now, to say that, especially now with a coronavirus outbreak that is impacting older people so much more, than younger people, and the general state of the health of both candidates, especially when you look at some of the things that Joe Biden has been saying recently and his inability to, put together coherent thoughts and sentences, makes me think that just because now it looks like Biden and Trump doesn't mean that in November those are the names that end up on the ballot. And so this can change a little bit. I guess of the last three major candidates that were in, it certainly seemed that Bernie Sanders had the best foreign policy record of the three. Now, I've always found it hard to say that Bernie Sanders is good on foreign policy. And I don't like calling Bernie Sanders anti-war because he never puts the issue front and center. And so often he completely ignores his opponent's terrible records on foreign policy, especially Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, where he could have beat them over the heads with their Iraq war votes, especially Joe Biden, who was so instrumental in getting the Democratic half and the Democrat part of the American Congress on the side of the war and selling it to the American people. He really could have and should have attacked him for that, and we never saw that. And so, in a way, it's unfortunate that Bernie Sanders is out of the race, because it's always great to have somebody there who may push the candidates towards a more reasonable or sensible foreign policy. At the same time, as a libertarian, Bernie Sanders spends 9% of his time talking about Medicare for all, or, payments, taxing the rich, free college, stuff like that. So I don't see it as being a huge loss. I just, think it's something that we should be mindful of as, we approach the election. And, nobody's really talking about right now. Maybe that's in part because they kind of feel like Biden won't end up being the representative of the Democrat Party, and there's no sense in talking about that now. But maybe just amidst the coronavirus and, Joe Biden really not being very public right now, that it's just not getting covered. But it doesn't mean that, they have like this unconscious thought that, oh, maybe it's not worth covering Joe Biden. Either way, just something to think about as we hear these two candidates speak and try to talk on their positions. I think both of them speak a better game on foreign policy than they actually are. With Biden, I mean, there's a very long history of being on the wrong side of a lot of these war issues. Now, he'll point out that, oh, I was instrumental in this drawdown during the Obama administration. But, when Obama hands it over, U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, so really can't brag about that. I think he was advocating the right way when it came to Libya and the Obama administration. But we are talking about an illegal war being waged there. And it's not like Joe Biden did everything possible to try to get the Obama administration not to do it. He didn't threaten to resign. He didn't resign. He could have. Resigned and said, the Secretary of State has the presidency here, and she just lured him into a dangerous and illegal war in Libya. This is a war of aggression. We didn't have to do it. Removing Gaddafi from office is going to be a major disaster. And it absolutely proof positive. Now we have 10 years later to see that country is an absolute disaster, still in the midst of a civil war. But, he didn't do any of that. And so, you can't really hold up Joe Biden's record on foreign policy at all. Any of the good things that he kind of has to point out and say, I think really end up in reality falling flat. And then when you look, he's really bad on things like Russia. And so, I'm not sure right now if you could say on foreign policy, Joe Biden or Donald Trump would be net better, because Donald Trump said a lot of good things as a candidate. He's done a couple good things as a president, but generally not very many. I guess Joe Biden could, kind of talk about some of the successes of Obama's foreign policy, like Cuba and Iran, which, Trump undid both of those. At the same time, Trump ended the CIA funding of the Sunni resistance to Assad in Syria, which was just funneling weapons and to the jihadist factions, and created this massive jihadi stand that Assad is trying and Putin are trying to take out right now in Idlib, Syria. And so, there's a lot of dark marks on both sides here. So, from my perspective, there's no way I could vote for either of these guys. The lesser two evil thing, these two people are both way beyond the level of evil that's acceptable to vote for, at least, from my perspective. But at the same time, the presidential campaign, hopefully, this coronavirus thing in the next month or two kind of fades out of the news cycle. We're able to talk about other news, and it will be an opportunity to talk about anti-war positions, and while both candidates should adopt them. And I'm sure, maybe Biden will say, oh, we should really get out of Yemen. That's definitely going to be something to say, good job, Biden, on that. Not that I'm going to vote for you, but, you're getting that right, but you get better, anti-war position going on overall. You'll see that momentum behind them. And hopefully, one of these two candidates gets elected and ends, a war or two. All right, so a couple things going on here in the U.S. that I thought were pretty interesting news stories. In Baltimore, the police are setting up, I think it's already in place, essentially. It's going to be an aerial surveillance system. It's going to cost $3.7 million to the Baltimore taxpayers in 2020. And they're going to have 3 planes that are going to fly around in the air. They'll be able to, in total, surveil 90% of the city of Baltimore at any time with complete live feed. So they'll, on one side of town, if you're walking to your car, and on the other side of town, your cousin is, walking to the store for an energy drink, these planes are going to surveil both of you, and the government would be able to surveil both of your movements at the same time. And this is really a crazy level of surveillance going on. Apparently, there's some restrictions in this program as far as the pictures are going to be somewhat pixelated, and they're only going to be able to look at this data in certain cases. However, we know how government program works. They're going to get better images, and then they're going to use this. They say first, only for homicide, rape, and carjackings, and then it's going to be, for any assault, and then it's going to be for, non-violent crimes like prostitution and drug dealing and stuff like that. And, especially looking at how much we've been willing to kind of comply with all the, additional surveillance and government dictates during the coronavirus, seeing something like this happen right now is really concerning, and I'm glad to see that I believe the ACLU is filing a lawsuit here, basically saying they can't violate the Fourth Amendment rights of every single person in Baltimore. So in response to the coronavirus, I think one of the most draconian things the U.S. is doing right now is kind of dictating where some companies are selling their products, saying that they cannot sell them overseas. So the big thing here is the U.S. has prevented, I believe it was 3M, from exporting some masks, including to Barbados. My concern is that this is going to be devastating to a small country having the supply cut off. But at the same time, apparently, the U.S. allowed a flight of 1 million masks out to Israel. And so, we're kind of seeing picking different kind of winners here. My guess is that most places in the country, other than, the really bad outbreak areas like New York City or the super rural places that don't have much, like the Dakotas, are living in a similar situation to me where some essential businesses are open. I'm now hearing a lot of people say that if you go to any store, you have to wear a mask to get in. That's not an optional thing. You got to bring a mask from home, have it on. That's the only way to get in the store. Other people are saying they're also requiring gloves. People talking about wiping everything they buy down and all these other things going on. But a lot of businesses are being shut down. And one of the things I want to mention that I think is very destructive going on, I hope nobody in my audience is engaging in it, but something that I think we should really make an active effort to stop is people snitching on people. I saw, this was posted in a Facebook group that I'm in from somebody that I've seen posting before. I think he's a genuine guy, so I'm not believing that he's lying, but I'm sure this kind of thing is happening, even if I can't verify in this particular anecdotal instance that I have. But he was keeping his business open, employing several people, and then somebody tweeted on Twitter to, I believe, the governor or something like, hey, why is this business allowed to stay open? And then like that, his business was ordered to be closed. I think the meme on Facebook is calling them a Karen. These people that are, calling and confronting people in public, having the police come, and just understand that if you call the cops on some, kids walking down the street, maybe not kids, but definitely adults walking down the street or, older teenagers, the cops are going to come arrest them and put them in a holding cell with dozens of other people. So you're putting them more at risk for coronavirus than had you just let them walk around. And so, that kind of authoritarian stuff that's going on right now in the U.S., I just think is really dangerous. I want to spend a minute talking about on the show. I've read that hospitals are having trouble getting access to some personal protective equipment, what they're calling PPEs everywhere. And that is because the U.S. government, and apparently the Department of Defense too, is buying it all up. The problem here, and I don't necessarily think it would be a bad idea for the Trump administration to say, hey, as the federal government, we're going to let states bid on ventilators and masks and stuff like that, even if that means bidding against each other, because that way, the states with the worst outbreaks will hopefully, be the ones that are willing to pay the most and get the masks the soonest. Whereas, let's say a state like North Dakota doesn't have much of an outbreak now. Well, they don't need to be, receiving as many masks as New York City. So it could be dangerous politics for the Trump administration to decide you get 1,000, you get 2 million, right? To just let the governors and kind of the markets on some level try to work there. But the federal government is buying everything off the market too. That seems to make this really problematic. And if we do see shortages of PPEs and not enough ventilators in some problems in some areas, I think the immediate solution is, libertarians, greedy businessmen, not enough ventilators, when in reality it's going to be government mismanagement of the situation. The acting secretary of the Navy has resigned. So this guy, Thomas Modley, who I believe was also the undersecretary of something else and also resigned that position as well, formerly in the Navy, but the outbreak on the USS Roosevelt, the captain of the ship, Brett Cozier, he can't contain it. So he reaches out, sends a letter saying that, hey, we got to do something because we're not at war right now and people on this ship are going to die. If we don't bring this ship to port, only have a skeleton crew on the ship to maintain the nuclear reactor and everything, disinfect the ship and get everybody else the hell off so they all don't get coronavirus. So for sending that letter, he gets fired. And then this guy, again, Thomas Modley, the acting secretary of the Navy, travels to Guam where the Theodore Roosevelt is in port and gives a speech or an announcement over the ship's PA and blasts the former Captain Cozier. Well, we've already seen on Twitter that as Cozier was relieved of his command, fired, and, his last walk off the ship was absolutely saluted and praised by his crew. It's no wonder that Modley giving this speech, revoked a pretty negative reaction, not only from the crew who absolutely threw that speech out everywhere, but also, the press and, different politicians. And this ends up with Modley resigning. One part of this story that I think is really important is that Captain Brett Cozier, I think in the conception that we have of the U.S. military, is not just like the ideal, but the standard captain, the guy who's going to stand up and do what's right by his soldiers and the right moral thing, no matter the consequences. And he got fired, and that was absolutely predictable. When in reality, I think he is the outlier, first of all, but then you see how the kind of system of the Pentagon reacts, and he gets fired. And even after all this, it doesn't look like he's going to get reinstated or anything like that. And likely, his career will stagnate there. From reading most analysts, if you're a captain of a aircraft carrier, it likely means like you're on a pretty good track, to end up as some kind of admiral. And so this will be a real blow to his career, and it'll be a disincentive from, other people from making the same apparently correct, decision, because, several more people on that ship have gotten sick, including, the captain himself, Brett Cozier. All right, so in Afghanistan, the Afghan government has gone ahead and released 100 Taliban prisoners. We'll see if this is enough to ignite talks with the Taliban. I believe I mentioned this on the last show, but just speaking of Afghanistan, while there is some fighting going on there, and that's not good with the coronavirus outbreak, you also have the situation. Remember, Afghanistan shares a very large border with Iran, and because Afghanistan has been at war for decades and decades, lots of Afghans have set up refuge in Iran along kind of in the border area. So now the coronavirus is so bad there, these people are flooding back into Afghanistan. As far as it goes here, the Taliban are taking this seriously. They're quarantining people, and so maybe this will keep the outbreak from spreading as much as it otherwise would. Who knows how the temperatures and the climate there is going to impact the spread of the virus versus, let's say, New York City. The demographics and the population density of a place like Helmand is far different. So hopefully it doesn't have a super bad outbreak in Kabul or something like that. But this is a country with a shaky medical infrastructure, or any infrastructure really, after, like I said, decades of war. The Palestinian Authority is reporting there's no more test kits left in Gaza. I believe that the number of positive quarantine test results in Gaza is below 20 at this point. So at least it hasn't gotten that bad, because there's definitely not enough, respirators and ventilators and all the other equipment they need in that area. But it's disturbing that they've run out of test kits. The Israelis have held up some aid, saying that it's contingent upon the remains, assuming, of a couple Israeli soldiers that were last seen in Gaza in, I believe, 2014, and a couple of civilian hostages that were also taken in exchange for getting any aid. It's important to remember when you look at the situation for the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, that these are an oppressed people, that they are under occupation. Gaza is pretty much an open-air prison. And so in that case, because the Israelis are enforcing that on them, there is some obligation there to provide those people with medical aid, medical equipment, food, and everything like that. They cannot collectively punish that population by withholding that. The OPCW has released a new report saying that the Assad regime carried out 3 chemical weapons attacks in 2017. I will have more details on this on Monday's show. There's a whole report from the OPCW. Looks thin to me. I see no reason at this point to, kind of take the OPCW for their word. I think the leads that we've seen from Ian Henderson and outlets, as far as the Duma, investigation goes, shows that the institution has been politicized. And I mean, I talked about it in, the, I think, 100-digit or so episodes of the show, probably 100 to 200, how I was concerned about the OPCW moving in this direction, and that one of the steps that was taken was, changing the way the charter was set up, putting new people in charge, and allowing the organization not just to put out reports of findings saying that we went there and this is what we found, draw your conclusions, to saying that we blame you for carrying out this attack. My guess is that people in the United States are going to try to weaponize this information to continuing a regime change effort against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Iraq's president has named Mustafa al-Kadhimani as the new prime minister delegate. I think he's going to have about a month to put together a cabinet to get approved by the parliament. Mahdi remains in the caretaker prime minister's role for now, but I didn't see a whole lot of optimism when this guy's name was put forward that he was going to be able to form a government. His current role is intelligence chief. Last up on today's show, just a little bit of a bright spot, possibly for Yemen, is that Saudi Arabia announced a unilateral ceasefire would take place on April 9th, so that's starting today. We'll see if it holds, or how interested the Houthis are in engaging in it. My fear here is that Saudi Arabia is getting some positive press out of this. People are saying like, hey, it looks like Saudi Arabia might be trying to wind down the war. And certainly there's reasons to believe that the situation in Saudi Arabia isn't great. This oil conflict, that the price war that they've provoked with Russia, is going to be problematic. Apparently, at least 100 members of the royal family have coronavirus. They also had the GCC dispute and their issues with Iran. So if they could resolve this situation in Yemen, it might be one less thing on their plate. And so there's certainly reason to think that might be happening. At the same time, the Houthis have been, gaining some ground recently. And so this might be the Saudi attempt to stop that, either by getting the Houthis to agree to a 2-week ceasefire and then not enter into any kind of serious negotiations with the Houthis, just keep the blockade of Yemen, keep the people of Yemen starving, and create a situation where, the Houthis end up breaking the ceasefire after a few weeks, and then the Saudis say, oh, look, they did that. But in the meantime, the Saudis were able to, build some reinforcements and stuff like that. And so strategically, I could see how, this could create a tactical advantage for Saudi Arabia. And I worry that this isn't, being approached with any kind of new outlook or increased legitimacy than any of the other ceasefires or, reduction in violences or whatever's happened over the course of the, now 5+ year Saudi-led war against Yemen. My understanding is that the Houthis have put together an 8-page proposal and they sent that to Saudi Arabia. From listening to some reports, as much as Mohammed bin Salman and the royals in Saudi Arabia are responsible for the war continuing, the sock puppet government that Saudi Arabia put in place in Yemen, led by Mansour Hadi, has actually been completely refusing to engage in any negotiations. So it's a crazy situation here where the U.S. sock puppet Saudi Arabia is completely out of control. And then Saudi Arabia also can't control their own sock puppet in Yemen, Hadi. And so now the U.S. has just been dragged into this 5+ year long genocide in Yemen. And at least for now, still no confirmed cases of coronavirus in Yemen. Let's hope that stays the case, because that country, people die of cholera. This is a far less serious viral water-borne infection that has, just fluids is what you need as a treatment, not a ventilator, not expensive medical equipment. And if coronavirus spreads there, it's going to be an absolute nightmare. All right, that's the show for the week. Hope everybody's enjoyed it. Make sure you share it. Libertarian Institute. Donate. Patreon.com. Ratings, likes, reviews, whatever you could do. Wherever you listen to podcasts, again, get the show a little bit more notice and out there. I really appreciate it. And, I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE.